Tonight, I would like to begin by acknowledging that StFX is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. Before colonization, Indigenous people were more fluid in their sexuality and gender. As a treaty people, it is our obligation to recognize the role of gender and sexuality in the dismantling of oppressive systems, as well as our collective efforts towards decolonization. I want to welcome everyone this evening to our Spill the Tea event from Stonewall to X Pride, which will be facilitated by Dr. Chris Frazer. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to highlight a few things. The presentation is recorded, but the chat box, Q&A, and the conversation after the presentation will not be recorded. After Dr. Frazer has completed the presentation, I can open the floor and we can turn on our cameras and our microphones, or you can comment in the chat box and I will facilitate that way. Now, to introduce our speaker, someone who likely doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Chris is an icon and a powerful and important presence in this 2S LGBTQIA+ community, both on and off campus. They were the very first advisor for queer students with over 14 years of voluntary service between 2004 and 2018. Chris has also produced Priscilla, Queen of the Highlands, which is our local drag show, for over 18 years. Chris is a well-respected faculty member on campus, being a professor in the Department of History within the Faculty of Arts, has received so much praise from so many students who have had the pleasure of being in their class. Being described by a student as, quote, best professor at X, Dr. Frazer is a breath of fresh air in comparison to other profs. They are fun, outgoing, caring, and truly respect their students. In addition to teaching, Chris has also published 2 books. When not teaching or writing or being a politician or engaging in activism, you will catch Chris on stage. They have been a very well-known drag performer for more than 20 years. See Leah Cruz and Joni Cash. Something that you may not know this evening is that you are in the presence of royalty. Chris was also crowned Empress 10 of Halifax in 2010 and is the current co-regent reign 21 of Halifax. As it is both a pleasure and an honor to participate in this event tonight, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Frazer.
Wow. Thank you so much, Amy. Now I feel like I have something to actually live up to. Anyways, thank you very much, Amy, for organizing this. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your evenings during a weeknight to participate in this forum. January is Pride Month at StFX. And as you are aware, we're in the middle of a new wave of the pandemic, and that has complicated the organizing Pride events for this month. So I actually would like to pay a great deal of respect to Amy, who has really been going overtime to hold the fort in what is probably the most challenging series of Pride celebrations we've had at StFX yet. So so really would like to make sure that people know what Amy is doing. So she's holding things together. So I want to thank Amy for that, and also for inviting me to do this for you. She asked me if I'd be interested in doing a spill the tea thing, and she suggested maybe Stonewall. And did I have a name for it? So I just made something up on the spot, Stonewall to X Pride, which is actually, when I think about it, a pretty, it is the road that has led me here in all kinds of ways. So I guess that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. I am a historian, but I'm also a member of the community. So I have a personal investment in coming to understand the history of how people like me come to be, and how we improve our lives and those of our community. And I'm a political activist also. And so when I look back at history, part of my whole reason for studying history is really to understand why things have happened and what has to happen in order to make the world better. And that's a material process. We need to be able to lay our hands on the world around us in order to be able to change it. And none of us can do this on our own. We're social beings, human beings. And so in the end of the day, it's necessary for us to rely on each other and to help each other through moments of crisis, and also for us to share a common vision for what this world could be like. So for me, this is what history is, and it's full of lessons, but those lessons aren't often easily come by, and there's a lot of history by people who aren't famous and who weren't really anybody. And so the things that they do tend not to make the pages of the mainstream history books. And for a long time, this was the story of Stonewall. And for even longer, this has been the story of earlier efforts by queer people to organize and to resist and to change the world. So I'm going to take a bit of a run at that, because it's also what happened here at StFX. I mean, really, I arrived here, I was nobody. I was in my first year at StFX, and all I was an untenured, tenure-track professor, and would have been easy enough for me to lose my job, but I had organizing to do, and the reason why is the same reason queer people always organize, is that where we live has got to be a place where we can live. So you lay your hands on the world around you, and you find other people to join in the project, and that's really what has happened at StFX and in Antigonish. But it's also happened repeatedly in the past, and so Stonewall is a lesson for us, and that created a foundation for all of the queer organizing that has happened in Canada, the United States, for sure, since at least 1970. So there's the connection, and I want to develop that a little bit. There's a lot to talk about, and I won't do that, but I do intend to hit some highlights that I think are informative, but also help to shed some light on at least my approach to organizing, and I think understand the phenomenon of X Pride, and maybe even Priscilla here at StFX and in Antigonish. And the first thing I just want to say, historically as well as politically, is that it's about the roots of our oppression as 2SIA LGBTQ people, or queer people, if you want to use that shorthand. The first thing I'll say is that we are oppressed. We're still oppressed. We have a wider menu of rights than our predecessors did, but we still have not arrived at the promised land, and there's still a ways to go. So we need to understand how it is and why it is that we still continue not to have full membership in the society in which we're born into, or which we arrive into in other means. So the truth of it, at least from my perspective, is that we live in a pretty exploitive world, and in order to exploit, you need to find people to exploit, and then you have to oppress them. And so we are oppressed, and the roots of our oppression, I think, are intersectional. I work with an intersectional analysis, but I have to add a bit of an asterisk to that. My approach to intersectional analysis is never on a personal level. So I don't look at somebody and try to figure out what their intersections are. To me, it's issues and movements that are intersectional, and we always have to look at how things that affect us also have effects on other people. Okay, so we're not an island. We've never been an island, and the ways in which we are oppressed also oppress other people. And here's what I mean. It's my argument. I'll make this argument that the oppression of queer people, of 2SIA LGBTQ people, has its roots in the oppression of women, or the identification of women and their subsequent oppression by people who identified as men. Mainly, and I won't get a lot into this, but mainly because in the emergence of private property and the accumulation of wealth, it became important and necessary in order to be able to transfer that wealth from one generation to another. This is the idea of inheritance, and we're all familiar with that. We are also familiar with the complications that come from inheritance when the line of descent is in dispute. And so for rich people, way back, it became really important for them to have some kind of certainty and guarantee that their descendants were actually their descendants and that the wealth that they had accumulated was going to get passed on. So how do you assure that? The simplest and most straightforward way is to control somebody's body, to determine who has access to that body and who does not have access to body. And therefore, you can have a fairly good idea that your offspring are legitimate. And this term of legitimacy also gets born with the emergence of the oppression of women. So why does this matter? How does this affect us? It's all about regulating sexuality. It's all about controlling people's bodies. And one of the aspects of controlling women's bodies meant that there had to be some way of certifying what was acceptable forms of sexual activity and which weren't. So then there's a breakdown between what kind of sexual acts you can engage in and which kinds you cannot. And one of the first waves of prohibited sexual activity was wrapped up in the term sodomy. So almost at the same time that women are being reduced to the secondary status, in fact, I would say becoming the vessels through which property gets transferred from one generation to another, there's also a more or less systematic imposition of prohibited sexual practices. And it gets wrapped up under the term of sodomy. Now, I want to say a couple things about sodomy because it's not what we think it is today. The anti-homosexual laws in Canada were anti-sodomy laws. The laws that still prohibit homosexual activity still exist in some states. For example, in Texas, they still have anti-sodomy laws on their books. It's illegal in Texas. It was illegal in Rhode Island when I did my graduate work there, and they were all referred to as the sodomy laws. The sodomy laws are actually a wide range of sexual activities and they're commonly defined originally as laws that prohibit any sexual activity that does not lead to procreation. Anything that does not lead to procreation. So then we get a whole raft of moral condemnation about all kinds of sexual activity, whether it's anal intercourse, whether it's masturbation, whether it's oral sex, all of that becomes regulated because it works against the transfer of property through a woman's body. Okay, that's a pretty broad assertion, and there's a lot more detail to it. But this is the origins for why and the logic for why certain kinds of acts between men become prohibited. It's not because they're two guys doing it. It's because their sexual activity does not lead to procreation. And that was the origins of the original prohibitions against sodomy. So this happens way, way back in the dim, misty past. And we have the emergence of very patriarchal, very oppressive kinds of societies that have continued to develop in various forms over time. Okay, so we have, we end up having sodomy laws. There has always been some kind of struggle against, whenever there's oppression, whenever there's oppressive regulation, there's always going to be resistance to that, and that was in fact the case. Now, I'm not going to go through any of that, but I am going to make a second assertion, which is that in periods of radicalization and even revolution, sodomy laws are among those to be the first tossed. When people are tired of living under exploitive and oppressive regulations, they tend to take a pretty close look at how their relationships with other people are defined, and they want to rebuild them. And this also includes, it's not talked about much in history books, but it also includes how we relate to people on very personal, physical and sexual terms too. So the very first decriminalization they abolished their anti-sodomy laws. It did not mean, I don't know if got a message that my internet was unstable. It didn't mean that they were encouraging sodomy, but they didn't see the point of controlling and regulating people's bodies. This was a period of feeling of freedom. Those laws then subsequently, the French Code in 1791, which abolished sodomy, then gets wrapped up into the Napoleonic codes, which then become the first civil law across all of Europe, and that's what leads to actually a recession in the oppression of queer people in Europe. It's not until the rise of nationalism in the last half of the 19th century in Europe that we see a very focused attempt to reassert sodomy laws, and it pretty much begins in Germany after it gets established as a nation around 1870, 1871. Otto von Bismarck personally supervised the reintroduction of sodomy laws and the abolition of the Napoleonic Code. And I mention this in particular because it's in 1921, with the collapse of that German Republic in the aftermath of Germany's defeat in World War II, which is a very radical moment in German history, that we see the rise of the modern LGBTQ2SIA movement of resistance. And its birthplace is in Berlin. By 1929, the queer community in Germany was on the verge of forming their own political party to begin campaigning politically, legally, and democratically in Germany to achieve the abolition of the sodomy laws in Germany, which were known as paragraph 175. They were very close to succeeding, and then suddenly this guy Hitler comes to power and crushes everything in Germany. So this is the rise and then the absolute and complete defeat of the queer liberation movement in the 1930s. They went to concentration camps, and most of them were killed in the Second World War. I'll also point out that they weren't liberated. They were the only concentration camp prisoners not to be liberated. They were sent to serve the Allies, Canada, United States, Germany, France and Britain, all sent the homosexuals back to prison after they emptied out the rest of the concentration camps. And that's the beginning of our modern oppression here in North America and in Europe. It started on that day. The other radical moment for the abolition, by the way, of sodomy laws happens in around 1919, 1920. And that was in Bolshevik Germany. That was one of the first laws that Bolshevik Russia. That was one of the first laws that went by the wayside. So it's a repeat in 1919, 1920 in Russia for what happened in 1791 in France. So we have periods of hostility towards queer people, and then radical moments which transform society. And one of the first things that changes is going to be those kinds of relationships. So there's a struggle, and it's been ongoing for a very long time. This sets the stage for what's about to happen in the United States and Canada through the 1950s into the 1960s and 70s. So, and that's really the most proximate foundation that gives us the tools and the perspective to begin doing organizing in tiny little rural communities like Antigonish. So what happens in the experience of the struggle against fascism in the Second World War unleashed a period of extremely divisive conflict in the United States. So groups of people in the United States who wanted to push the ball forward, and some, especially Republicans and those like Joseph McCarthy, wanted to hit the brakes. And so the United States actually entered a pretty dark period in the 1950s. It also happens to be the period where the first real organizing for the queer liberation movement in the USA begins, and it begins with a guy named Harry Hay. Harry Hay was a veteran of the anti-fascist struggles of the 1930s, and he had watched the crushing of the queer liberation movement in the Weimar Republic, and he watched queers going to jail in Germany. He was also a member of the Communist Party USA, and he was the lover of a guy named Will Geer, who ended up playing Grandpa on the Waltons, who was also a member of the Communist Party USA, just by the way. The thing about that is not so much about their ideology, but it is about what you learn in those kinds of movements about how to organize under really adverse conditions. So Harry Hay, 1945, 1946, decided he was going to organize homosexuals in the USA, and he founded a group called the Mattachine Society. And he did it by collecting anti-nuclear war signatures on the gay beaches in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and made his contacts and then called people together that had found an organization. The Mattachine Society was established, and then soon after that was a parallel organization established for lesbians called the Daughters of Bilitis. And both of them were facing some pretty difficult circumstances. For example, it was a felony to send any of their literature through the U.S. mail. It was a felony. You would go to jail for a very long time if you were discovered having been the one who was filling the envelopes with the publications, the magazines of the Mattachine Society of the Daughters of Bilitis. And that happened. People went to jail simply because they were sending this kind of material through the U.S. mails. They persisted, and into the 1960s, times started to change, right? The civil rights movement emerged, which had been percolating for quite a while through the 40s and into the 50s. But it hit the stage in a big way in the 1960s, and it was the strategies and the tactics, really, of the civil rights movement that really began to influence the early organizers for the queer liberation movement. So, intersections, once again. The oppression of Afro-Americans paralleled, their resistance started to parallel the resistance of queer people in the United States as well. And it was also happening at a time of an upsurge in the radicalization of young people right across the United States. So there was an appetite to see a much different looking America in the 1960s. What that would actually come to be, nobody knew, but what everybody did know is that the 1950s were no longer a suitable standard for measuring anything in the United States. And this leads to the emergence of things in the, like sit-ins, picket and protests outside of the White House, things that the civil rights movement had been doing. Now the queer liberation movement was also doing. They called themselves at the time the homophile movement, lovers of men, basically. So there were, I have a list here, actually, just a very short list. 1965 in Philadelphia, there was a sit-in at Dewey's lunch counter. So in Philadelphia, they were refusing to serve homosexuals, and so there was mass sit-ins, which is a repeat of what the civil rights movement had been doing. This was 1965. 1966, there was a sip-in New York. Bars in New York were refusing to serve people suspected of being homosexuals. And so homosexuals went into bars en masse, sat down, ordered drinks, and then forced the establishments to expel them. And this just caused disruptions in business. 1966, also the riot at Compton's Cafeteria in San Francisco, when the police raided that establishment, which was frequented mostly by men, drag queens, what we would now understand to be trans people. And a similar protest happens for similar reasons a year later in 1968 in Los Angeles at a place called the Black Cat, which had also been raided by the police. So what we're seeing, these are just some examples of a pattern, okay, that of organized public resistance to the oppression that people were facing. And really it was just the enforcement of the sodomy laws that were existing in the United States. So of course the police are going to be the blunt end of that stick. They're charged with enforcing the laws. So really what happens next in 1969, it was just a matter of time. It was just a matter of time. It was only 2 years after the riots at the Black Cat, and it was a similar kind of story. It centered around the Stonewall, which was not much, by the way. It was a bar that catered to gay people that was owned and run by the mafia. And this is one of the other very unsavory outcomes of being made illegal, is that this creates a space for organized crime to enter in, and they start to service your needs as well. So the Stonewall was kind of a hole, really, but it was a safer place for people in Greenwich Village, which was the hangout for the queer community. Well, the cops had a deal with the mafia. They periodically carried out routine raids, and they would call the establishment ahead of time, say we're coming, and that meant that they would get rid of the worst of the most incriminating evidence, but they really never did much for the clientele to protect them. And again, that night it happened. This time it was different. People were tired, people were sick, people had been radicalized by things like the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and they just said, no, we're not going to jail anymore. we're not going. And as they were pushing somebody into a squad car, somebody threw a bottle, somebody threw a rock, and the fight was on, and it went on for 3 days. 3 days, the cops tried and failed to suppress. They call it a riot. I call it was an uprising. I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but this was the moment. And it's not that Stonewall was all that different from any other rebellion or resistance or riot or protest. Just think it was the time. It was the time. And it resonated across the country. And by the next year, we had the first Gay Liberation March, and that was the beginning of Pride, really. And it just took off. It was as much timing as anything else. People were ready for it, and especially the younger generation were ready for it. Young people. And I see that today, just by the way. My faith and hope, absolutely. I'm so impressed with the younger generation these days. I just think they do the most amazing things. And so they get all the support in the world from me. 3 years later, after Stonewall, that wave starts to crest in Canada, and we see it in Nova Scotia in 1972 with the formation of the Gay Alliance for Equality in 1972 on June 4th. And the very first thing they did was to establish something called the Gay Line, which was a phone hotline, and they staffed it with volunteers and circulated a number in the personals of publications like the Herald and so on for as long as they could. Sometimes they'd get pulled. And the idea of this helpline was for people who were in distress or needed help in some way, who were queer, would have somebody finally to reach out to and a sympathetic ear. And it's really kind of, I don't know, maybe it's hard to imagine these days, but in 1972, that was just like a miracle. Really vital service that this organization was offering. They also established a publication, so they began publishing, and this was the origins for what we have now in the form of waves. You know, so we still have a publication that speaks about our community. They also decided to begin a fundraising campaign in order to purchase their own building, which would then serve as a broader community center in Halifax, so a place for all of the community to be able to collect. And they ran it themselves, they protected it themselves, everything. And I think it was really quite a model for effective organizing. They eventually ended up owning a building called the Turret in the Khyber building on Barrington. And that was also, by the way, the moment when we had a stable performance space for those of us who were drag performers. So the politics creates the opportunity for a culture, what I think was a cultural renaissance in the queer community between the 1970s and into the 1980s. And that was what allowed people like me to become performers and to eventually be able to come out. So Stonewall to the organizing in Halifax to the organizing in Antigonish. And I'm just going to say a few words about that process too. So I arrived in Antigonish in 2004, and I was coming to Antigonish from Providence, Rhode Island. And at Rhode Island, I went to university doing my PhD work at Brown University, and this was a microcosm of all the benefits that had come out of Stonewall, because out of a university of about 5,000 students, which is all Brown had, something like 400 or 500 were members of the of the undergraduate gay society. And you couldn't run for election at Brown as an undergraduate student for the Students' Council without getting the endorsement of that organization. I'd never seen queer people ever be able to exercise that kind of power and influence, and it popped the eyes out of my head. I became president eventually of the queer grad body, and got a chance to organize the very first Pride Month. It was a Pride Month, actually. It lasted 6 weeks. And we had a queer convocation at the end of it, and the guest speaker was Leslie Feinberg. Now, I was already friends with Les, but I'd never met Les personally, and that was a whole other level of learning about myself and about the approach to organizing. And I absolutely carried all of that with me to Antigonish when I arrived. I will say that I had intended to behave myself when I got here. I wasn't going to raise a fuss. I wanted to get my tenure. I wanted to get a secure job and finally make some decent income for the first time in my life. But that November, there was a gay student from the Bahamas who was hospitalized after a homophobic assault. And then on February 2nd, a well-known gay man in the community was also attacked and hospitalized. And then in March, I got attacked outside of the needs. I didn't get hospitalized because, I don't know, I'm a hockey player or something. But this was 3 explicit homophobic assaults within the space of 6 months. And it was pretty clear that something had to be done. At that time, I was involved with an ad hoc group on campus called the Committee Against Misogyny and Homophobia, which was mainly feminists and supporters. And again, I come back to this notion about our oppression being intersectional and our necessity to rely on each other as allies. And this was a beautiful example of that. That's where the idea was hatched out to have an LGBTQ advisor at StFX. And then the vice president, Students, who was the only woman ever at StFX until recently who occupied a senior administrative position, she asked me if I was willing to take on that job. And I think I thought about it for 2 minutes and said, yeah, I'm going to do it. Because as much as I wanted to play it safe and to make sure that I got tenure, there would be no point to it if Antigonish and StFX never became a place that I could live in without having to look over my shoulder. Or how could I raise my kids in an environment like that? So you can't. You have to roll up your sleeves and you have to get to work. Well, I was a drag performer. I was a bit political, so I knew how to do 2 things. One was to organize protests, and the other thing was how to organize shows. So I decided I would rely on those talents, and so that led to the formation of X Pride and the very first Priscilla in 2005, and we've been going ever since, and we've been growing every year. We have still a long way to go, but there's been an awful lot accomplished, and I got to also say that X Pride has produced some of the most remarkable young leaders that I have ever seen. One of whom I'm just going to mention off the top is in a real difficult struggle right now. His name's Andrew Danson. And Andrew has also become a really important voice for handicapped people in this province and across the country too. But he's just one example of, consistently outstanding descent of student leaders who stood up and stood the gaff, because it's not always been really very easy at StFX, but they keep coming and keep pushing forward. And their work, their consistency, their dedication is what eventually, I believe, compelled the university to get rid of me as a volunteer and to finally commit the money to hire a staff person who could ensure the kind of stability and continuity that our community requires here. See, the reason why that was so important is that for a long time, I felt as if what I'd been asked to do was a little bit of window dressing because it might hamper recruitment. And so, you kind of take that with the good because it gave me an opportunity to organize. But finally, I think the university woke up a few years ago and came to understand that queer folk here aren't going anywhere, and we're not going to accept not being fully equal with everybody else. And so we're going to stick around and we're going to do what we have to do to organize. So I'm kind of on the downward slope of things these days, and it's a real reward for me to be able to just accept invitations now to come and speak at things, and to be able to watch and encourage and support people like Amy and Henderson and everybody else who has picked up the rainbow flag and has moved it forward. So anyways, those are just a very brief outline of how all of this has connected to help us here in Antigonish to undertake a struggle to make this a place where now you can go down a lot of streets here in Antigonish and you'll see rainbow flags flying off of people's front doorsteps. And for me, it's just the most beautiful feeling in the world. So I might actually end up staying here now. Anyhow, I'm gonna leave things there. I think I've talked longer than I wanted to, and I'd really like to give other folks an opportunity to ask questions or to chip in their own observations, because I'm sure some of this has resonated with you as well. Anyways, thank you to Amy, thank you to Henderson, thank you to X Pride, and thank you to everybody who has taken the time to come out and listen to me ramble on tonight. So.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much for your presentation tonight. I hope that people were enlightened, and it makes them want to do more research, and it makes them want to learn more and learn how to be, the advocacy that we need and the supports that we need. I'm going to stop the recording and open the chat back up so that we are able to communicate openly.